All right. Again, this is Gateway API meeting for December 20. Fairly light agenda today, but most noteworthy is the next two meetings are canceled due to the holidays, and we'll get back on January 10. So enjoy your time off for anyone who's taking some time off. And yeah, this is our last meeting of 2021. So with that, there's a brief update on the 0.4 release. Last meeting, I discussed a potential patch because there were a couple issues in the V1 Alpha 2 API that we wanted to fix. As I was getting ready to push that release out, I realized there was one more that was just kind of sitting and waiting, and that's this fix from Steve, where he pointed out that there's at least one use case where having a wildcard in a host name, it's a redirect to a wildcard, does not make any sense. So he cleaned up the validation on that. I think there's one comment outstanding on this PR, but I figured this would be good to include in that release as well. So yeah, anyway, that's why I'm holding off on the 0.4.1 release. Does that make sense? Anyone rather not include this specific fix in that release? Cool. All right, I will keep on going then. The next item is probably a little bit more contentious, and that's coming back to this port matching support. I think I'm the only one who's commented yet, well, myself and Chow so far. But I'm wondering if anyone else has some like higher level thoughts on the idea of adding port in this context. And for anyone not paying attention, the idea here is to add port to parent ref in for route-based port matching, or for gateway attachment, depending on your perspective.
Rob, is there any update from the last time we discussed this? Like,
yeah,
in the last meeting, we had like an extensive discussion. I didn't take.
Yeah, that's it. So I know Chow has pushed a number of comments here and updated the GEP for, I think, everything. I hope I'm not missing anything that we discussed. But there was a fairly large update push since we discussed it last week. Yeah, I think the biggest question that was left open is one that I tried to address here, and that's just, is this really enough? Are we going to want to add more things to parent ref, a few months or years from now? And I tried to address my perspective on it here, but I don't know. I'm interested in what others think as well.
Okay, yeah. I mean, so there were like two ways of framing it. One was like, are we going to add more, and why can't we use section name instead of port? Those were like two discussions we had in the last meeting. I haven't taken a look at this, so I'll add this in my backlog.
Thanks. Yeah, and I know Chow did cover the section name versus port fairly well now. I know that was one of his updates. So hopefully that section is a little bit more sensible now, or more detailed. The other area, yeah, I agree. It's just kind of, will we ever expand this? And if so, what would that look like? I think that's covered a little bit in the GAP or PR here, but I just added my own thoughts as well. Since it's one of those things where we're trying to predict the future and potential use cases we might have. I'm not really, I've been trying to think of any, and I'm not really aware of any. The label selector I know has come up before. JSON path for all its, you could do a lot with that, but again, it's just trying to come up with a concrete use case for it. I don't know. So it's a little hard to predict the future with these APIs, but my personal take is that this doesn't prevent expansion from happening. It just, we should be aware of any short-term things that we might want to add, and I can't think of any. But yeah, thanks for adding that to your backlog. And Does anyone else have a perspective or thought on this concept here?
I'm just curious. The parent ref, is the parent ref in this case, in the child's particular case, is that still pointing to gateway, or is pointing to some other object?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's really two potential use cases this gap proposes, as I understand it. One is for the most traditional approach, which would be for gateway to route relationship, which basically says, hey, I want to attach to this gateway on port 80. That would be how you would interpret this. On the other hand, where Chao is coming from is Chao is working on a mesh implementation of this API. And I think he's most interested in the other side of this, where their parent resource is something that represents a mesh. I'm not exactly sure the specifics, but I think it's a mesh custom resource that is the parent of their routes. And so this is basically saying, hey, I want to attach to this specific mesh on port 80 or 443 or whatever port it might be. So that's my understanding of the two use cases here. So I think it makes sense for both, and it's a similar interpretation, but I think Chao is mostly coming from the mesh side of things.
But I think the one thing I'd say is for the route inclusion delegation proposal, where it was what we talked about was having the child routes, their parent ref would be the parent route that they're being included from. That's another way we were looking at using the parent ref.
Yeah.
So I haven't had a chance to look at this PR. I'm not sure. I'm just kind of commenting towards or providing that in support of your comment about the are there going to be other things that we want to include in parent ref in the future?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think parent ref was intentionally left a little bit open, so we could have these kind of more expansive uses of parent ref. Unfortunately, Jeff, the use case you called out is an important one, because parent ref for route inclusion or delegation or whatever we end up calling that, if we use that approach, it means that both section name and port become meaningless in that particular, well, as far as I can tell, they would become meaningless when route is a parent, because there's not a clear what is section name, what is port when you're attaching to a parent route. And I think that's probably acceptable. It wouldn't be the only time we have fields that have no meaning in a given use case, but it's just something that we have to keep in mind.
Right.
Cool. Any other comments, thoughts on this particular proposal? All right. Well, I'll leave this one as is, but again, if you have time over, I know it's holidays and whatever, so don't work extra for this, but if you have extra time in your work day, would love some more feedback or thoughts on this one. I'd love to get this one through to this upcoming release if possible, but or not necessarily get it in. I mean, getting it would be great, but I'd just like to get consensus one way or the other on this one. All right, the next one is conformance tests. This is really, really early. I'm trying to be careful with how I phrase this. This is very much work in progress, draft, all the things. I wanted to file this PR early enough, just in the process, because anytime you try and add an initial structure for conformance tests, there will be plenty of opinions on how to structure things, on how to approach different aspects of it. And so, we have a gap the GEP provided a baseline that this follows, but the GEP left lots of details unanswered for sure. And so this tries to fill in a little bit more of the details and structure, just sketch something out. It does overlap a little bit with the ingress controller conformance helpers and logic where it can, but a lot of this is, new or different, I guess you could say. The thing I want to highlight here is there's a lot of messy code in here. There are many, I wouldn't get too involved in the detailed code review if you do have time to look at this. What I'm most interested in is just, does the general structure and layout of this code make sense? Do the structs, most specifically the conformance test struct, make sense? And then the way I've added some really basic docs around this. Do those make sense? And really not even, I'm sure there are typos and whatever in the docs, but does the direction I'm going with the docs and with the proposed flow I'm working on here actually make sense? So those are kind of like the higher level kind of feedback that would be really helpful at this stage. With that, let me get into the basics of it. This is really all that it takes to run conformance tests in this world. So one, there's a conformance test suite that you can set up without too much effort, and you can pass a set of tests for it to run based on, I'm thinking I'll probably we should probably split conformance tests into different packages maybe. I'm not entirely sure here, but basically the mechanics are that with some pretty basic code, you pass in a client and the name of the gateway class you want to use, you can run some conformance tests. So this is very much with the use case and thought process in mind, that as much as we want people to use our CLI, we also want these tests to be something that we can integrate into our own dev workflows. So this is something that I've been trying to test out with our own GKE implementation of this API, just to see if, hey, can we run these tests regularly in our own test suite? Can we integrate whatever structure we have here? And that really is the idea with how these are structured, so that they can easily be integrated into other workflows, hopefully. So that's the gist of this. This is using the controller runtime client, which sounds like almost everyone is using already. So shouldn't be too surprising there. I've already described in a previous meeting this kind of idea of a base YAML for a conformance that basically describes a set of resources that we can structure tests around. This includes namespaces, some gateways, which could be pre-provisioned. I'll get into that later, and a variety of other things that just kind of make for a nice environment so every test definition doesn't need to redefine the pods, the service, everything else around it. Just there's kind of this shared understanding environment of tests. Yeah, I've talked a lot already. Are there any questions before I keep on going here? Any questions or thoughts on the basic structure so far?
I like what I'm seeing.
Great to hear. Yeah, that's awesome. So yeah, I'll keep on running through this. Again, I think this base is basically 3 namespaces, each include a service, a deployment, nothing too crazy. These are using Echo server, so we can parse the results. That actually matches with the same thing that ingress controller conformance is using. So again, there's some overlap through here. And then you're also going to see our manifest for a individual test case. This is one that I'm not thrilled about. I tried to do some inline YAML and it technically worked, but trying to do inline YAML inside Go is awfully messy and gross. So, whatever. The corresponding test that goes with this YAML is defined with this conformance test suite or test definition, right? So you've got a short name, a description, a set of manifests to apply, and then a test function. So the key thing about this test function is it doesn't need to worry about actually applying this or cleaning anything up. This, if this is wrapped already by a function that applies and cleans up anything defined in here automatically. And then you just have access to client and test framework, and you can write whatever you want in here. It's pretty straightforward. There should be not much in the way of surprises. But this is really one of the areas I wanted some focus and feedback, not on the specifics of this test case. This is just a nonsense test case. I have a controller name hard coded in here right now because I haven't. Anyway, there's still work to do here. But with that said, the idea that this is kind of the API and structure that we're working with and looking towards for defining tests. Yeah, that's really it. This matches again the gap description for what we're defining here. So I'm hoping this won't be too surprising. But again, it is kind of a baseline that I'd like to structure other tests with if it makes sense. Any thoughts, concerns around this?
I think this is a pretty feature-packed start. I think we should try to write more tests around it and gain feedback from that cycle rather than thinking too much about sort of thinking like it's very hard to predict how these things go in reality, especially like something as deep down as these tests. So, but I really like the structure of the way how you have laid it out. So this is good. And I think, and then you export these tests so that they can be added or removed, right? That's what you had in the previous. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. You got it exactly. And you described exactly the challenge I've been having so far is at some point, we just need to have tests. We just need to say, this is good enough. We need to have a base set of tests that we can work with. And we're awfully close to that point. And the other side is like, I'm trying to build something that is reasonably solid as a starting point. So we don't have to keep on shifting beneath as we add more tests. But at the same time, the starting point for these tests and this framework is fairly large. And I'm trying not to be too overwhelming with like this PR is already, I think 800 some lines of code. And I'm trying not to balloon that out too much further than it already is. But again, it's just trying to find that right balance. But I'm thinking this is around the scope I'm going to try and keep this at. Maybe add one more test definition just so we can see some variety and actually complete this one even. But again, I appreciate that feedback.
The client, so the client that we are seeing as the second parameter to the test function, what is that? That's like a Kubernetes client?
Yeah, it's a controller runtime client specifically.
Oh, okay. And is there a client for like, HTTP client? Think about that. Like, is there a client that talks to gateway, or is that something we have to instantiate out of band in here?
So thank you. That is a great transition to I think kind of the last and most poorly defined aspect of this yet, and we'll get here eventually. I have this HTTP round tripper interface that is not too different from what is it has a lot of overlap with what is an ingress controller conformance. Again, the details of this interface need work, but the idea is clear that I want the thing that's making HTTP requests to be something that can be overwritten. That's very important for us if we're trying to integrate these tests in GKE, because we want to be able to make requests to say an ILB and not necessarily be running the tests in the same place that you can make requests from, as a rough example. But I imagine this kind of idea of overriding an HTTP client could be potentially useful more broadly. With that said, we'll ship with the default one that tests would use by default. Again, the idea is fairly straightforward, that you'd have a request. It would basically take a request as param and then return captured request response and an error, where the error is specifically some kind of unexpected error making the request itself, not a HTTP error code or something like that. Yeah, so this needs a lot more work, but this is kind of maybe the most unique, or something like that didn't come out of the gap. This is just something that came out of at working through this and trying to figure out how we could integrate this throughout different test frameworks. It seemed like it would be a useful thing to be able to override in certain cases. Yeah, but that very much is something like I forget exactly how I integrated it right now. I think it's something like that I connected to the test suite. I can probably do that to the test definition as well. Those details are less critical in my perspective. The biggest thing is, I think anyone who's using these tests will be just passing in this and then not really caring. Once they have the suite, they can run whatever and they're done, and they don't have to interact with anything below that stage. But yeah, that's what I'm thinking there. I don't know, what do you think? Is this something that would be useful to anyone else?
I think so. It will be useful to us. Shane is not on the call, but yeah, he would agree.
Okay. Cool. All right. Well, yeah, that's a lot about conformance tests. I think those are the highlights of this PR right now. Again, I think Harry was already saying, like, we do just need to get something in. There's those areas that I'm trying to work through, most notably the HTTP interface and just finishing out some test definitions. But comments on structure, on any of these areas would be really appreciated. And I'll keep on pushing updates to this PR as I go. Yeah. Cool. Any last thoughts or comments before I move on? Awesome. All right. I think we're on to the last one then. And this is the only one I added to PR and issue triage for today. Let me know if I missed anything else. I think this is a good point that our docs are confusing here. We've kind of left this open that says, hey, you can re-encrypt traffic when it's coming from, for the basically connection from gateway to backend using HTTP route or TLS route. But we have not provided any standard way to re-encrypt that traffic. We've just said it can be done. And Harry, I think you were the one who commented most recently on this. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're hoping that we can add this kind of capability to the API directly and not just say, well, technically it can be done, but you need some kind of custom something to do it. It depends on your implementation. Yeah,
I think I had sort of mistakenly assumed that something like this existed. Now, upstream TLS is something more, like, not everybody uses it, but it's a fairly mature and fairly standardized solution. So we should, maybe if we didn't, I'm blanking on why we didn't do it, but we can say this, but we should, I don't see implementers using it still, but we should standardize it. And we definitely should at least communicate that, hey, we intend to have this in the API rather than as a custom one-off mechanism.
Yeah, that makes sense. That lines up with what I was thinking. I wanted to clarify, you mentioned something about, we should have a concrete plan before we get to beta for this. What do you mean plan is in just, we should have a proposal or gap, but not necessarily implemented before we get to beta?
That would be a pretty ideal case. I'm not sure if you'll be able to get to it, but at least have like verbal discussions, say this could be implemented in these fashions, and people are like, yeah, this makes sense, and something like that, rather than, hey, shoot, we didn't take this into account. And I don't think it will be causing a big change, but mostly people are in agreement rather than being surprised later on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it seems like what we need here are two things. One, we need someone to volunteer to just update the docs to clarify that this can be done, but we don't have a standard way to do this yet. And second, somebody, this is a larger process, but somebody to actually propose how we could do this in a standardized way. Does that seem accurate?
I think so.
Yep.
Cool. All right. Well, if anyone wants to volunteer to take on either of those, would love some help on this one, especially the docs update. If anyone has any interest in leading a gap, this could be a good one to work on as well. So either you can volunteer now or volunteer on the bug afterwards. This is 968. Cool. All right. Well, I think that's everything we have for today. Any last things anyone want to bring up? All right. Well, hey, thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your year, and we'll talk to you in the new year. Have a great one.
Thanks.